Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is another case that was unsolved. Well, another Baby Doe case, okay? This is the case of baby Opelika. And recently, not too long ago, she was finally given her name back through DNA technology and all of that jazz, which is amazing as always. So let's jump into her story, and for anyone that hasn't already heard of it, this was suggested by one of you guys, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions you guys have, and of course if you have any more, please do let me know. So let me take you to a place in Alabama in the US called Opelika, and this is where baby Jane Doe, well, she was actually known as baby Opelika, because obviously nobody knew who she was, but this is where she would be found. On the 28th of January in 2012, police get a call from a member of the public who is ringing to say that they have potentially found some human remains. This was in a Brookhaven trailer park, and they thought that they had potentially found a skull, like a human skull, and it was a small skull, so probably that of a child. They found it in the yard of somebody's residence, and as the police obviously went out and they investigated further, they found more of the child's remains about 50 sort of feet away from the skull, and those were more in the woods, I believe. So around the area, they found this long sleeve pink shirt. It had heart-shaped buttons and ruffles, and they also found a section of curly black hair. What they thought had happened potentially is that some sort of animal had potentially dragged sort of the head, I know this is grim, the skull away from the rest of the remains. Of course, the first thing that the investigators checked was if there were any missing children in the area, but there wasn't. So of course the police gathered up all the remains that they could as carefully as they could, and they sent it out for an investigation, an autopsy, you know, whatever you want to call it, to try and just find out how she died, who she was, if they could find out any of that information. What they found out was the remains belonged to a black female. She was between the ages of 4 and 7, and she had been abused throughout her life, and especially before her death. Her body had been just thrown out in the woods like trash, which is just so wrong anyway. They found 15 rib fractures. Oh no, sorry, not rib fractures, just blunt force, like trauma fractures just throughout her body. They were on her ribs as well, but they were on her skull, her arms, you know, they were just everywhere. And not only were these fractures sort of everywhere, some of them were in different processes of healing as well. So that means that some were older, some were newer, you know what I mean? Others had pretty much healed, so they were a lot older. So it wasn't a beaten up and they were all fresh kind of fractures. This was a case of abuse. She was also on the more underdeveloped side, so they figured that she was very malnourished too for the age that she was at least at the time of her death anyway. She had a fracture to her left eye socket, which meant that she was actually blind in her left eye, and the police really did think that this was important because it would have been a physical thing that you could have seen. So you could have seen that she was blind in this eye. It wasn't like, you know, some people who are blind, the eyes just look normal. This would have been a visible blindness kind of thing. So police would have hoped that maybe that would help them along the way of identifying this girl. And it hadn't sort of just happened either. They figured it was at least months, maybe up even to a year before she died, you know, this injury happened. The police put out like a statement. They didn't release all the information. They wanted to find her, but they didn't release a lot of information. They said they believed that she was murdered, that it was a homicide, and that it had potentially happened between 2010 to 2011. And if I didn't actually mention it, they found her remains in 2012. It didn't really take long for, after this little girl was discovered, for them to come out with a clay reconstruction of her face, of what her face might have looked like. They released that out to the public. They put it everywhere in the newspapers, billboards, you know, everywhere you could think of, just to try and get her identity back to her, find out who this little girl was. And it did actually work, because somebody came forward to say that she looked remarkably like a little girl that went to a Bible sort of study school in the summer of 2011. They honestly did believe that this little girl, so she provided pictures as well. She took all these pictures, and in these pictures, right, this little girl was blind in her left eye. Physically, you could see it. It was like a cloudy eye. And they had not released that information to the public, so this woman would have never have known that. She just sort of recognized her off the facial reconstruction and figured that it looked like her at the very least. She did not remember the child's name, but she did remember, obviously, that the child's left eye was deformed. The pictures also show a little girl about the age of 5, which is sort of just over 1 year above the estimate 4 to 7, in like a pink sort of shirt, which does look similar to the shirt that was found near her. This lady said that in summer of 2011 she went to this Bible school. This little girl, she was very sort of unkempt, not very clean, very shy, very withdrawn, and sort of kept herself to herself. She also really had struggled with communicating with the other children and just didn't seem to be on the same level as them, like, I guess education wise. Like she couldn't hold up a conversation very well with them or anything like that. So what does that tell you straight away? Essentially, she wasn't in schools or anything, you know. If she wasn't around people and able to communicate in the school like that, then maybe that's why. Obviously, there are other reasons, like, you know, autism or sort of other disabilities or dyslexia and things like that. I'm not saying that that was the only reason, but an unkempt, sort of pretty dirty child who goes in there and isn't really communicating very well, not on the same level as the kids, it does raise suspicions like that. They tried to get records from the children that attended, you know, the church thing, but they'd all gone at that point. They couldn't identify her through that way. They released the photos to the public and nobody came forward to identify her that way, and so they were still, well, they were a bit closer. They knew hopefully a little bit more about her, but still at square one, they didn't know who she was. People took this case to heart. They wanted to give baby Opelika her name back. Some literal detectives didn't even want to retire until they got to that stage, kind of thing. You know, that's how much it meant to them, and that's how much they wanted to do this for her. They really tried with like things like DNA as well. Obviously, they wanted to see if they could get anything from that, you know, find her DNA, find out who she was. Obviously, there was issues with that too, though, because animals had been out of bones. There wasn't a lot. Well, it was just bones, and so a lot of things you need tissue or, you know, to get the DNA from. That was where the technology was at that moment, and so they couldn't really get anything from her. So eventually what they did is they did there's some sort of test that you can do to get DNA from the bones, like extract it from the bones without actually needing the flesh. So obviously that's what they ended up doing. And people have also commented as to why, because her was found there too. Like, you can get DNA from her, but it has to be like the root, I believe, like the root follicle, rather than just like the ends. So they weren't able to get DNA through the hair. Despite all their efforts, despite following thousands of tips and just trying their very hardest to find out who this girl was and who had done this to her, they didn't really get anywhere, you know, for a decade at least. Everything they'd attempted didn't work. The DNA didn't come back to identify her, so they didn't give up, obviously. They kept on trying, but they were just sort of, it was getting cold, I guess. Then in January of 2022, they found out about this test that they can do. They sent it off to Opelika Forensics Lab in Texas, and this is where they used a technique called forensic grade genome sequencing. And so they can do a lot with a little bit of DNA that's even degraded and things like that. And that is why they sent it there. I have no idea about the ins and outs of this. Obviously, it's too much for my brain. But they did get a DNA sequence for baby Opelika. Well, they built a DNA profile. Then they brought in a genetic genealogist who had helped to identify the Golden State Killer, remember him? who was done after like 60 years or whatever it was. I've done a video on him. I can't exactly remember the exact amount of time, but he got away with it for all of his life. And then they finally caught him using this same technology. So what they did is they used this DNA profile to track down basically relatives of baby Opelika. And in October of 2022, that's exactly what they found. One of her relatives. They actually managed to find her biological father, who was a 50-year-old man called Lamar Bickerstaff Jr. At the time of them finding him, he was in Jacksonville. But before that, he had lived in Opelika. And that's actually where he was born and raised. So, yeah. He was in the army at the time, apparently. They go to tell him that his daughter is deceased, and he is basically like, what daughter? Don't know what you're talking about. Don't have a daughter. Yada yada. He didn't even tell them their name or anything like that. Well, he's not going to tell them the name, is he? Because he's claiming that he doesn't have one. That sparked interest in the police, obviously. He is her father, and he's claiming to know nothing about her. Which is strange, right? I get... Obviously, sometimes people are in a relationship, they get pregnant, they have babies, and maybe the dad don't know because maybe the mum don't want them to know. Okay, that's fair enough. So what they do is they go and try and find out more information on this. He is actually married to a lady called Ruth. He's been married to her since 2006. And so they go and speak to her. And again, she said she had no idea what they were talking about. She didn't have a clue about this daughter that he had, and nobody knew nothing about it again. And they wouldn't tell them. They said that they had no idea who the biological mother would be because obviously they didn't know who she was and didn't know that she existed and all of that stuff. So basically, they had made this massive breakthrough in the case and then got sent straight back to like, well, not square one. They had a bit more information. But you know what I mean? Like, they got set back because they just claimed that they had no idea who she was. I mean, there's a reason for that, let me tell you. But we'll get more into that in a little bit. In December of 2022, the police ended up traveling down to Maryland, where they went to speak to a woman called Amore Wiggins. She was 37 years old at the time, and she confirmed that she had given birth to a little girl on the 1st of January in 2006 in her hometown of Virginia, and she actually called this little girl Amore. And that basically Lamar, who they spoke to before, well, guess what? He was the dad. She was 19 at the time. He was 35 years old. And they got together, he got her pregnant, they had a baby together, Amore. What had actually she then went on to say was that Lamar's family was really disappointed with them being together out of wedlock kind of thing and having a baby out of wedlock. And they eventually like split up and moved out, but obviously it came to who was going to get Amore, you know, as custody of her. Apparently he was an absent father at this time, but Sherry said that she made mistakes, she was facing misdemeanor charges, and she honestly felt that Amore would be better off with her dad. So when he got custody, you know, she was all right with that. And obviously she was very young as well. She was 19, well, like 20 at the time. She still wanted to be in her daughter's life. She still wanted contact with her. She absolutely adored her. But obviously he got the custody, and so she wanted to set up like visitation rights and things like that and having her, you know, all over the weekends and whatnot. It made sense for him to get the child because she would have somewhere like more stable to live, or so she thought. She visited her a lot, you know, she absolutely loved her. She came around a lot, and Lamar let her. That was until the Navy moved him to Hawaii, and then that was it. He cut off all ties. She would call up to try and make arrangements to see Amore, and he would be like, no, I'm not making special arrangements for you to come see her. All of this just horrible stuff. He kept blocking her phone. She'd ring on a different phone. He'd block that one. She'd do something else and he would block that. She just, no matter what she did, any point of contact she tried, he just wasn't listening. He wouldn't let her see her daughter. And so the only thing that she felt like she could do was basically pay child support. She'd been paying child support all that time. Don't get me wrong, that was a continuous thing. But since he wouldn't let her see her own daughter, she really honestly believed that maybe when she was 18 and wanted to come and find a biological mother, that she would. And she would basically say to her, you know, I've been paying for you all these years. That proves that I love you. I wanted to see you. He just wouldn't let me. And that's honestly what she was hoping for after all this time, was that one day her daughter would come knocking on her door and they would have some sort of, you know, relationship finally after not being allowed one for so long. She'd appealed as well, but the court said to her, like, you've exhausted all options kind of thing, and so she couldn't really do anything else. It was also said that Lamar was, before she left, shoving her around and things, and, you know, that was when she realised that was enough. When they went to court, Amore was only 3 years old at the time, and she just figured that, well, she didn't know that he would cut off all ties with her eventually, obviously, and she figured that her daughter would be safe with him. How incorrect, sadly, that would turn out to be. Because obviously now we jump back to 2022, 23, and she's getting a knock at her door from the police asking if she has a daughter, and she's thinking that she's got a 17-year-old daughter out there somewhere. And he's now finding out that her daughter was murdered, essentially, because they what they think happened is that she was abused so much that she eventually, her body gave in to her, you know, to everything that was happening to it. She couldn't cope with it any longer, sadly, so she died. So she was murdered. But yeah, she thought she had a teenage daughter out there somewhere who would maybe turn up at her doorstep years later asking who her mum was. And all that time of thinking that and paying, and she'd been paying the alimony all that time as well. And it turns out that her daughter had been murdered at the age of 5. I can't even comprehend such a thing. You know, she really tried to get in contact with them and stay in contact with her, and they just wouldn't let her. But no wonder, because he'd killed her. Well, somebody had killed her, whether it was him, the biological dad, Lamar, or whether it was his wife, Ruth. Who knows? But yeah, they had done something horrific to her, and so no wonder they were dodging and blocking the calls. But they still kept collecting that child support in though, didn't they? Now, Lamar is actually the one who has been charged with regards to Amore's murder. So I believe they're thinking that he has done it, obviously, and Ruth has been charged with failure to report a missing child. But who knows? Maybe they were both part of it. Maybe she did it. Maybe he did it. Maybe they did it together. No idea. Obviously, Sherry was cleared with regards to it because she was able to prove that she didn't have custody of Amore, that they had the custody of her. They went out and talked to schools and offices and all sorts of doctors and whatnots, and they found out that Amore had never once been sent to a school or a doctor's office or a paediatrician or anything whatsoever, which, like I said before, it is also believed that the girl in the photos was Amore. And that is probably why she was really struggling with communication, because she had never been enrolled in a school. The Bible school that she attended, or it's thought she attended, I don't know if it's fully officially confirmed that it was her, but I think they believe it was her. It was only 3 miles away from where her body was found. So we're thinking along the lines of here is potentially he sent her there to get her out of his hair because he'd had enough of her. He was obviously abusing her, or she was abusing her. They were both, whatever. Whoever was abusing her sent her there to get him out of the way for a bit, and then carried on abusing her. And sadly, her body couldn't cope with it anymore. Like I said, they believe that potentially he lived in Opelika at the time. He was born and raised there. Obviously, moved away and moved out since. Or maybe he was visiting and he buried her there because that is where she died. I don't know, but they are thinking that is where she actually died, because why on earth would you, if she died elsewhere, then take her to Opelika to bury her? It doesn't make any sense to anyone, really. I am glad that eventually these people were caught and that, you know, it's still going through. I believe charges haven't actually been made yet, trial date or whatever hasn't gone through yet. So it's still ongoing, but, you know, Sherry has had her world shattered, really, because she genuinely thought that she had a kid out there and she just didn't for such a long time. And I can't even comprehend that. She did a fundraiser to try and give her daughter the send-off. She was going to do a bit in Opelika because obviously they kept that case so close to their hearts and they really tried so hard for her, and they eventually managed to give her her name back and get it solved. So she did like a remembrance thing there, but she wanted to bury her remains where she lived in Virginia. And that's what she did. She did a fundraiser last, you know, poor little Amore finally got the send-off that she deserves, rather than just being tossed out like a piece of trash and having animals and stuff ransack her body, which is just disgusting. But I'm just glad that justice will be served at the very least. So thank you so much for DNA technology. It's just amazing. I keep saying it over and over, but it really is. The advancements that we're making and the people who are putting in all of that time and all of that effort and all of that brain power is just fantastic. Yeah, this case is very heartbreaking, but she finally got her name back. She finally gets justice and gets a burial spot. I mean, obviously, we all would have rather hoped that she would be a teenage girl living out a life. Sadly, that was not to be the case for her because of this evil, twisted man and woman in her life. It just breaks my heart. But yeah, that is the end of the case. If you guys have enjoyed this video, give me a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for similar content. Anyway, that's all I have today on the case of baby Opelika, who we can now say is called Amore Wiggins. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.